So I go and I end up, I meet this guy at the coffee shop. It's a coffee shop that I knew well. It was where I had been doing a lot of work, and I was actually reading some work for this book at the time in that coffee shop. I was reading Herman Melville's book, The Confidence Man, which is central to the kind of framing of this book. I'll say just a brief bit about it in a minute. As soon as I get in there, I see he's already there before me. He's sitting at a table. He's got a bunch of books stacked on this long, low table. And he gets up to greet me and puts his Stetson hat down. He says, "Thanks for coming to talk to me. I think we can do a lot of good work together." And then I'm starting to get nervous. Like, I don't know what this guy wants. I don't know what we're supposed to be talking about. He seems real mysterious. He tells me he's working on a mission for sustainable environments, and he thinks I can be helpful for him. And I asked him what the mission was. I couldn't tell if that was like a religious mission or an organization. He said, "Yeah, it's a broad mission. You know, we're all passengers on spaceship Earth, and we're all here together trying to make our way." And his kind of tone and language and demeanor maybe a little more suspicious. And I don't know if it's because I was reading the book The Confidence Man, which is about con men. Con men is short for confidence man, or not. But we talked for about 15 minutes. I said I had to go and I couldn't continue. He said, "Well, maybe we can meet again." And I said, "All right, I can probably come back next week." And he says, I don't know if I'll be here next week. I'm moving to New Mexico. This is like a Thursday. And I thought, we can meet on Monday. You don't know yet if you're moving to New Mexico in 3 days? He's like, "Yeah, I'm not sure yet." It's like, okay, I guess maybe you just wanted to connect with the university where I worked. I guess maybe you wanted some money. I wasn't exactly sure. But throughout the whole conversation, I felt like, is he setting me up for some kind of con? Like, I don't know what he wants out of me. So I get home and I Google the guy again just to find out who is this guy. I got his name. And even before I did that, he had already emailed me. And his email had a small recap of what we talked about: local food systems, sustainable agriculture, trying to build a better world. And at the end of the line, he said, "We're all in this mission together. And for me to pursue my mission, I need some money." And so it seemed obvious at the time. It's like, all right, now he's to the next hook in the con. I've been reading about this, and here's this guy who I don't know who he is. He seems suspicious. He speaks suspiciously, and I don't know whether I should trust him. And the theme of trust is at the core of this book about food. And the theme of trust began and was centered a lot on that guy's conversation. I use a quote in the book to get a sense of this about face values. "In every walk of life, men assume the expression and manner which they believe will make them as they would wish to be regarded. Thus, one might say that our world consists entirely of face values." We today would say, is it true that what you see is what you get? Is it true that the face that you present to the world is a window onto the reality of who you are? Can somebody tell your true soul by looking into your eyes? Or are you presenting a false front? This is what The Confidence Man was about. It's a Melville book from 1857. It's certainly not as widely read as Moby Dick, which had come out 6 years earlier. Please notice the subtitle is His Masquerade. The Confidence Man is a book about a bunch of travelers taking a riverboat up the Mississippi, and one person trying to con another person, trying to con another person. And the masquerade is the face that you put on to prevent somebody from knowing who you really are. This is the core of, for me, what was interesting about writing a book about food purity and food adulteration, which had to do with authenticity and sincerity. So there's a host of key terms: trust, confidence, authenticity, sincerity, being genuine, or its opposite, disingenuous, questions of character. And all throughout those, they are the difference between surfaces and interiors. Are you really who you say you are? Is that food really what you say it is? If you had to summarize the theme of the book in one line, it would be that trusting food means trusting people. So the book's ostensibly about the origins of manufactured food. It offers a picture of when and how in the US we started to make foods in factories and not just harvest them from fields or process them as part of agrarian communities. It's a story from the 1860s to about the 1910s. And the end of the story leaves us with the founding of the FDA and the underpinnings of modern food regulation. I will read the end of the prologue, just the last couple, not even a couple paragraphs of the prologue, which I think captures what I would have paraphrased anyway. So when I was putting this together, I realized why don't I just read it straight up. And there I say that debates over purity and adulteration means contaminated, corrupt, or deceptive foods. Debates over purity and adulteration provide a window onto the origins of manufactured foods and the perceived problems that they wrought. Indeed, disputes of what was then called the era of adulteration revealed confusing new tensions in the ways people understood, bought, trusted, and ate their food. Cultural factors help explain why anybody cared. They show that a prevailing suspicion of cheats, deceivers, hucksters, and conmen, and the corollary fervor for sincerity, authenticity, and honesty, all that provided the foundation from which the era of adulteration was born. Environmental factors help explain why those cultural concerns were exacerbated. So new supply chains, complex commodity flows, far-flung land use patterns, and theretofore unknown ingredients, they all form this new infrastructure of food and agriculture that made the view from farm to fork thick and opaque. So together, that host of cultural and environmental conditions shaped the Pure Food Crusades in the set of chemists, analysts, and public health officials bent on commandeering and policing that concept of purity. So whereas into the mid-19th century, into the mid-1800s, it was still common to understand food based on its origin, based on its provenance, and based on its purveyors. By the early 20th century, the concept of purity had moved from its agricultural setting and relocated into the hands of the analyst and the lab. Purity had become a scientific concept. It was policed by government agencies and backed by certified analysis. It would be the analysts and the scientists who drew that line between pure and adulterated. So Pure Adulteration, this book, looks to the Pure Food Crusades to tell the story about cultures of authenticity and manufactured foods of questionable purity. Along the way, it shows the way farmers, manufacturers, grocers, housewives, government officials, scientific analysts, public health officers, customers, consumers, how they all sought to demarcate and patrol this ever contingent, always contested border between purity and adulteration. The book about the Pure Food Crusades is really about how people drew that line between pure and adulterated. Because there is, and there was, no natural pre-human distinction that you can simply uncover and enforce. People have to decide where to draw it and how to police it. So today's world is different from that of our 19th century forebears in so many ways, but the challenge of policing the difference between acceptable and unacceptable practices remains central to the daily decisions about the foods we eat, how we produce them, and what choices we make buying them. Now, that's the setup for the book. For our sake, tonight, so that you don't have to sit here and read the whole thing. For our sake, these questions dominated the discussion. How could you know that new manufactured foods were okay to eat? How can you know if somebody wasn't trying to pull one over on you? Pure foods, they're like organic or natural today. That's what you wanted. You wanted a pure food. People feared that those new foods were adulterated, that they were corrupted, that they were tainted, and that they'd cheat your wallet and maybe they'd make you sick. That means, put another way, that the book explains how and why people understood, resisted, and reshaped a new food system that we eventually called industrialized and modern. The book has 3 sections. I'm going to give you a quick gloss of the 3 sections. The first one is about the culture of adulteration. It's called the Culture of Adulteration. So here's where I really get at trust, sincerity, authenticity, character, face values, confidence, the genuine, and the pure. This part includes the story of that man in the Stetson hat, but it begins with a different con man who becomes the baseline for the rest of the book. It's this guy. This guy embodied all the things that I wanted to get at in this study. He's a chemist, he's a world traveler, and he's a con man. Papers called him the king of swindlers. One paper described him as a man with the form and features of an Apollo to match the polished manners of a citizen of the world. Another called him handsome, polished, well-educated, known for his keen intelligence and ready wit. A Brooklyn paper said that he stood above and beyond his fellows who, compared with him, were mere bunglers in operations which he had reduced to an exact science and of which he was the greatest exponent. He was striking too. He was physically striking, they thought. You see people calling him, I don't know why they honed in on polished as the main descriptor here, but they also said that he had the suave address of a gentleman, which you should write down because that's a great description of someone, the suave address of a gentleman. And yes, as you can see, of course, he had a wax tip mustache, a twizzled mustache, as one person said. So his big con, which we learned about right off the bat in the book, his big con was margarine. He was running the margarine con, fake butter. This in the 1870s, as margarine had been invented in 1869. That's what got him to be called the king of swindlers. The issue at hand is that you might not know what you're getting when you buy your food. And so if you think you're buying butter, but then you're buying this new upstart industrial product called margarine, you might be pissed off. This becomes a much bigger problem when you have to buy your food from someone else, someone outside the agrarian world. For that reason, the next part of the first section of the book puts a lens on the grocer's market, because the grocer is a main mediator between you and your food. These were not like our grocery stores where you pick up packaged goods from a shelf. That model of what we call the self-service grocery, well, we don't even call it self-service grocery anymore, but when they invented it, they called it that 100 years ago. That model develops in the 20th century, didn't exist in the 19th. The grocer's market was much more like a pharmacy, where the grocer handed you the product across a counter. They were often accused of adulterating the food behind that counter. And so, oh wait, I have a picture. This is actually from 1855, so it's been going on for quite a while, and more so in England. But if you can't read the caption, the little girl comes to the grocer's to ask, if you please, sir, mother says, will you let her have 1/4 pound of your best tea to kill the rats with, and an ounce of chocolate as would get rid of the black beetles? And you can see that the underside of his counter is full of poisons. The grocer was maligned while trying to establish this beachfront as the main mediator in terms of how you got your food. And so I end up talking a lot about the ways that the middlemen developed trust and faith of the customer, because that was essential to allay the fears of the era of adulteration. Now, much of the way they helped to get that trust and faith was to work through chemical analysis, so that by the 20th century, grocers were hiring chemists to verify for customers that their goods were what they said they were. Or it depended on a new genre of domestic science, where housewives could learn techniques of chemical detection so they could check it out themselves in the kitchen. That comes up later in the book too, so I'll leave it merely mentioned here. So these are the features that help us understand the culture of adulteration. Where does it come from? Why do we have it? And how do all those key terms of trust, sincerity, authenticity, and confidence start to dominate the concerns about food? Now, in the second part, I move from the culture of adulteration to the geography of adulteration. In here, I look at my 3 main case studies. So the big core of the book are these 3 case studies. They are glucose, cottonseed oil, and oleomargarine, the aforementioned oleomargarine. This is my favorite cartoon. It's from 1887. It's from a magazine called the Rural New Yorker. I make a really big deal out of it. I use it as the frontispiece for the book. I wrote a whole essay about it once many years ago. I really wanted it to be the cover of the book. The publishers argued with me and said, no, it's too busy. I said, no, but I love it, and I've imagined it that way forever. And so I got the other cover, which everybody seems to love. So I now officially love the other cover, but secretly still love this one. This is the 3-headed Hydra of adulteration. Hopefully you can see that the neck is labeled with fraud. We've got the industrialists with their stovepipe hats in the back, egging on this industrial beast, this 3-headed Hydra, which is attacking and challenging our good old American farmer. You got a cow and a pig running away. I'll say just a little bit about each of the 3. Oleomargarine, you notice that it has actually a bandage on its neck. It's because the cartoon is from 1887, and 1886 is the first federal law about adulteration of food in the United States, and that was the Oleomargarine Act of 1886. So if you need trivia, or if that ever becomes interesting to say, then you can say, oh, it was 1886 was the first federal law of adulteration. I doubt that'll ever happen, but when you see this cartoon, you'd say, oh, I know why it's got a bandage. Cottonseed oil. Actually, I'll hold off on the other 2 because I'll get to them in a minute. But these are the three main case studies. And what I wanted to do was work through the environmental networks that produced these adulterants, so we had a better understanding of why and in what way they were controversial. So for oleomargarine, people thought this was fake butter and therefore it was bad. Um, what I'm after in this big middle of the book is that these new supposed adulterants were integrated in vast geographical networks spanning the globe. That means that any assessment of good versus bad or pure versus adulterated, the two are often mapped onto each other, um, was far more environmentally entangled than just a matter of final contents. It was also about process and agricultural activity. I made a series of maps, and I had great help in doing this from a number of people, including first off at the beginning, Emily McGinn, and all throughout John Clark. You don't have to really study this map. I just wanted to show a picture of it so you can see bunches of lines going everywhere. And the thing you take away from was, oh, this is about oleomargarine, and there are lines going from the United States out to the world, and there's bunches of lines. I just noticed now that I didn't even put the legend on this one, but the thickness of the line indicates the order of magnitude of how many pounds they were selling or they were shipping. And this was in the hundreds of millions of pounds of margarine being shipped across the world. This is just a snapshot from 1900. The next case is cottonseed oil. And here I actually took two of them. Here's 1880. So you can look back and say, oh, I see a bunch of lines. Look, isn't that colorful? There's arrows and there's points and there's hash marks. At least here you can see the legend. And then boom, 1900. It's a lot more. So the whole point is, look, they were sending a lot. You know, here's 100 million pounds. By 1900, it's like 1 billion pounds of cottonseed oil. Most people might not even know what that is. Before I started this project, I actually didn't know what it is. When I saw that cartoon of the three-headed Hydra, I had to look it up because it didn't quite register what they were talking about. After the cotton harvesting process, you would long have this byproduct of discarded seeds, usually heaped on the side of the field, sometimes used for cattle feed, but generally wasted. After the Civil War, they started to call this the Cinderella of the South, this product which had been the ignored stepchild who blossomed into a recognized beauty. Southerners in the 1860s and then increasingly 70s, 80s, 90s first brokered deals with Italian olive oil makers because when you crush the cotton seeds to express their oil, that oil's consistency and texture and taste were reasonably similar to olive oil. So you can mix it in, you could save money, and then the Italian olive oil makers could import it back to the United States with a pure label falsely attached to it. So here's this sense of adulteration, like it's not really what it is. And we're still dealing with questions of pure olive oil. So guess what, that's not new. So that was one revenue stream for this cottonseed oil. The other one was intracontinental, where the southern cotton growers were selling this to meat packers in Chicago, because the meat packers were big lard salesmen too. And they would cut lard, pig fat, they would cut it with cottonseed oil, and they would have a cheaper shortening used for cooking and kitchen management. So that too was like, oh gosh, it's supposed to be pure lard, but now I'm worried that you're selling me something that isn't what it's supposed to be. So people freaked out about that too. This is where you probably actually have heard of cottonseed oil, even if you didn't know it. And you find this out if you read the book that Procter & Gamble came out with a popular shortening in the early 1900s called Crisco. If we were in person and not virtual, I would pause here and then I would like raise my hand and make some kind of snarky comment of raise your hand if you've heard of Crisco. So you can still raise your hands wherever you are. I just can't see you. If you've heard of Crisco, then you do know what cottonseed oil was because Crisco is a contraction defined by its main ingredient. Crisco stands for crystallized cottonseed oil. By the early 20th century, Procter & Gamble was making Crisco out of any kind of oil they can find and almost always vegetable oil. So it's no longer cottonseed oil, but that's where it starts. Here's my third case. This third one is glucose, which I know is now a reference to blood sugar. But in the late 1800s, it was the name for sugar that was derived usually from corn. Here again, beautiful map. Thank you to the map team for helping make all this. On the left, you see the United States, and there's a bunch of lines going out, and they're spreading out to the world, and we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds of glucose being shipped across the world. Glucose was likewise reviled for the offense of seeking to trick customers who wanted pure sugar, which at the time was either cane sugar or beet sugar. Um, Cane sugar and beet sugar had their own problems in the sense of their aspirations to be pure. They were quite morally sullied products who, for cane sugar, which is a heavily slave labor dependent product, and beet sugar was had its own labor problems in the US. So it's not like glucose was so much worse than them, but people had the perception that cane sugar was real. You could do the air quotes for real there, and glucose was fake. And I think I won't say more about that case, but please tweet me about your comments on it after you read it. Now, the third part of the book, in part one, we have the culture of adulteration. In part two, we have the geography of adulteration. And in part three, we have the analysis of adulteration. This third section is about chemical analysis. This section shows how new scientific and analytical techniques to identify and define purity replace those older place-based, agrarian, and experiential ways of understanding purity and adulteration. The key of this last part is that these new technologies of food identity were given form by the cultural and environmental circumstances of the prior decades. So my favorite source, Puck Magazine, which was the Onion of its day. Here's a snapshot or one of their cartoons from 1884. It's called Look Before You Eat, showing the chemical analyst detecting the truth that lies underneath the surface of the food. Part of this section of the book paints a picture of local and regional groups putting together their argument that we needed to fight for pure food with new science. Part of it then looks at the national scale, where chemists in the USDA, specifically their Bureau of Chemistry, led the way in the same fight. And we care because those efforts led to the founding of the FDA after the passage of what was called the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. If anybody knows anything about this era, not if anybody, but usually when people know something about this era, they may know about 1906 because that's also the year that The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was published, which put a nail in the coffin to decades of work trying to pass a federal anti-adulteration act. They might also know that Harvey Wiley is a key figure. In fact, there was a PBS documentary earlier this year called The Poison Squad, which was all about Harvey Wiley's efforts to fight for pure food. Harvey Wiley was the chief chemist at the Bureau of Chemistry in the USDA and one of the most prominent spokesmen and representatives in congressional hearing after congressional hearing to try to get pure food legislation passed. This one to me seems a little on the nose. He is very proud of this kind of stuff. He was not a modest person. But here he is attacking impure food with the spear of chemical analysis behind the shield of pure foods. And it really was a crusade, as they called it, the Pure Food Crusades. The key for us, and the reason that we care about this, is that while food regulations have changed over the century, there are always new layers wrapped around the old ones, like an onion. So that as we sit here, the ideas and structure of food safety and agricultural policy of a century past remain at the core of how we understand the right way to police the boundary between purity and adulteration, between acceptable and unacceptable foods. So I want to finish with two brief thoughts. I'll go back to the book cover. Isn't it a great book cover? I can't imagine it any other way. Let me finish with a couple brief thoughts. One is that when we're arguing over the validity of new foods, of new agricultural practices, of genetic modification, say, or of additives, or if almond milk is really milk, you can just the air quotes again, is it really milk? Or is the Impossible Burger really a burger? What we're really doing is arguing over where the line is between acceptable and unacceptable. And I guess more to the point, we're having a political debate over authority. Who gets to decide what's in and what's out? Who has that authority? Why do we believe them? Why do we trust them? Trusting food means trusting people. Still, as with the dawn of manufactured foods, I'll say it again. Trusting food means trusting people. So a final thought is that we used to make these decisions from the grounding of much fuller environmental lives. We made these decisions as part of agrarian communities. We made them as defined by the contours of the growing season and the demands of building a flourishing agrarian life. No more. We are consumers now. We are separate from the production of food. We are beholden to choices made at the market, which means we depend on labels, certification, and other third-party verifiers of authenticity. But we could build new forms of engagement with our food system that connect rather than disconnect us. And I think and I hope that could be our future. So that's my overview, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben.